Welcome to a new episode of Sandblot, the International Society for Rorschach and Projective Methods podcast. Featuring exclusive interviews, the Sandblot wishes to contribute to the oral storytelling tradition by taking ISA members on a personal encounter with notable Rorschach and Projective Methods experts. We want our listeners to hear our guests relate stories and discussions about their research, theories, practice and collaborative experiences that have changed their lives and the landscape of the Rorschach and projective methods field, from history to the most modern research findings, histories, and clinical cases that are reshaping the field. Our guests will answer questions, teach, challenge, surprise, and inspire you. We are happy to speak today with a special guest, Catherine Chabert from France. Thank you very much, dear Catherine, for welcoming us into your home to engage in this discussion about the Rorschach test and projective methods, and for agreeing to do this podcast for the members of the International Society for Rorschach and Projective Methods. If you agree, I will start by introducing you briefly, and then we will spend some time discussing your encounter with the Rorschach, thematic tests, and your interest in these thought-provoking but sometimes criticized projective methods. You have made significant efforts to demonstrate their value in understanding both normal and pathological modes of psychic functioning, so it goes without saying that your opinion is of great importance to us. Few people know that when you were a psychology student, you graduated at the top of your class in experimental psychology, specifically to avoid working in psychopathology. However, through several remarkable encounters, as you yourself described them, particularly with Didier Anzieux, Daniel Widlocher, and Nina Roche de Traubenberg, you eventually embraced a career as a clinical psychologist, psychoanalyst, and university professor. In 1990, you were deeply involved in organizing the Congress of the International Society of the Rorschach and Projective Methods in Paris, a huge success with over 600 attendees. You established the Laboratory of Clinical Psychology and Psychopathology at the Psychology Institute of Paris Descartes University, and you directed the university degree in projective psychology during several years. In 2008, you were awarded the insignia of Doctor Honoris Causa from the Faculty of Psychological and Educational Sciences at the Free University of Brussels in Belgium. The speech in your honor underscored the significant contributions of your work on projective psychology and its links with your research in the field of psychopathology. In 2019, you received the Marcel Blum Prize from the French Academy of Moral and Political Sciences. Today, you are a member of the Psychoanalytic Association of France, Professor Emerita at Paris Cité University, and Honorary President of the French-speaking Rorschach and Projective Methods Society. So perhaps we could start by discussing your introduction to projective methods. How did you encounter them?
I didn't encounter projective methods at the beginning of my studies. My first degree was in philosophy. I was in Nice, in the south of France, at the time. But I was disappointed by philosophy, and speaking with close friends who were in the university in Aix-en-Provence studying psychology, I decided to join them and begin a psychology degree. During this period, I was interested in experimental form of psychology. I had a very defensive position in relation to clinical psychology. I told my friends that clinical work implied too big a responsibility, and I had misgivings and doubts about my ability to engage in clinical psychology. During my studies in Aix-en-Provence, I met René Caes, who was a young teacher in social clinical psychology. He was Didier Anzieu's colleague, and he worked with psychoanalytic theory. He suggested I joined as an observer in dynamic group sessions. I was very enthusiastic with this experience. He spoke a lot about Didier Anzieu and about psychodrama. I then decided to move to Paris because I wanted to pursue this path, and by chance I went to Nanterre University, where Didier Anzieu, Daniel Villochet and Roger Doré were all teaching at the time. There I met Didier Anzieu, and he convinced me to consider psychopathology, even though I was primarily interested in social psychology. Since this moment, I developed a passion for psychopathology from a psychoanalytic perspective. My encounter with projective method was also by chance. I had completed my studies in psychopathology, and one evening I met with a friend of mine, and she told me she was on her way to an introductory lecture on projective methods by Nina Roche de Trobbenberg. So I tagged along, and I was very impressed. I then met Nina Roche de Trobbenberg, who offered me a teaching opportunity. I also decided to meet Daniel Villochet, and I asked him to be the director of my thesis. Very quickly, I was given a scholarship, and I became a teaching assistant. Didier Anzieu created the first certificate in projective techniques in the 1960s at the Sorbonne. And Daniel Villochet later entrusted Nina Roche de Trobbenberg with its direction, which she passed on to me in 1980. For me, it was quite natural to follow the path they had opened: psychoanalysis, psychopathology, and projective methods. Didier Anzieu, Daniel Villochet, and Nina Roche de Trobbenberg were, at the same time, very invested in clinical practice and teaching at the university. They offered me both activities: clinical at the Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital in the pedopsychiatric service, where Nina Roche de Trobbenberg was director of the psychology laboratory, and teaching at Paris-Sorbonne Institute of Psychology, where Daniel Villochet and Nina Roche de Trobbenberg were professors.
Given your experimental background and initial disinterest in psychopathology, how did you develop an interest in projective methods and a psychoanalytic approach to these methods?
I have just told you the discovery of psychoanalysis, psychopathology, and projective methods is simultaneous. At the time, between 1970 and 1980, psychoanalysis had a very important place at the university, in clinical practice, and in psychiatry. Nina Roche de Trobbenberg was a pioneer when she came back from the USA and applied a psychoanalytic approach to projective methods. When I studied projective methods, it was therefore from a psychoanalytic perspective. This coincides with the beginning of my own psychoanalytic training. When my thesis directed by Daniel Villochet was completed, I became a university lecturer. I also worked as a psychotherapist and a researcher in a specialist service for adolescents at the Montsouris Institute in Paris, directed by Professor Philippe Chabert. Teaching projective methods and psychopathology has always been very important to me. Projective methods have allowed us to support, explain, and develop a psychoanalytic approach in psychopathology because of the discursive material which they mobilize on the one hand and via the analysis of significant psychopathological factors on the other hand.
How did you reconcile psychoanalysis and projective methods? Projective psychologists are not always open to psychoanalysis, and psychoanalysts have not always respected the value of projective methods for enhancing psychodynamic understanding of the psyche.
From my point of view, psychoanalysis and Freudian psychoanalysis in particular are not only focused on the therapeutic method. While the method remains very important, the epistemological dimension is also crucial because Freud always stresses the interface between clinical experience and meta-psychology. From the beginning, there was a continuity between normal and pathological, which was often seen as scandalous in Freud's time and still is seen as such today. During my teaching career, there was no issue, and we could accept that the aim of projective methods was to analyze individual psychic functioning. Projective methods yield key components of psychic functioning, and as such, they are very helpful. We wanted to show students how projective methods could be a precious mediation in understanding of what happens for patients, for their internal and relational world, as well as their external reality. Even if I speak about this long period as ideal, there were of course times of contention, as you suggest in your question. Even at this time, projective psychologists were not open to psychoanalysis, and they defended a more technical use of projective methods in order to preserve what they called objectivity in their view of what psychological tests may achieve. But we could discuss our differences. It was possible to have true debates between us, and they were very constructive. They forced us to be clear and respect a more quantitative approach, especially with the Rorschach. These projective psychologists worked essentially with the Rorschach. But in France, thanks to Nina Roche de Trobbenberg, there was another use of projective methods which was fully embedded in psychoanalytic reference, thematic apperception test, that is TAT. On the other hand, psychoanalysts were not convinced by projective methods at the time. To them, projective methods were just technical tests, and they were very much against any form of investigation of psychic functioning through them. I remember that as a young analyst, I didn't like to speak about my teaching at the university, because there was a kind of contempt for projective methods, because they were considered as a form of betrayal of psychoanalysis. Generally speaking, universities were looked at suspiciously by psychoanalysts, even though, paradoxically, many famous names such as Lagache, Villaucher, Anzieux, Laplanche, and many others were teaching at the university.
Now, let's talk about Nina Roche de Trobbenberg. She was elected president of the International Rorschach Society in 1987, enriched by her exchanges with colleagues from the United States, especially Roy Schaeffer, and various other countries. She greatly advanced Rorschach research by identifying the latent elements unique to each card, showing the test heuristic value for exploring aspects such as body image, ego, non-ego differentiation, and issues of identity and identification. She also developed a meticulous protocol analysis methodology. You two made some remarkable explorations. Tell us about it.
I explored both the manifest and latent content of the test material, Rorschach and TAT, as well as the dynamics of transference within this clinical framework. I proposed significant modification to protocol analysis to reveal psychic processes engaged in terms of representations, affects, identity, and identificatory dynamics, conflicts between psychic structure or system, and the nature of the anxiety and defense mechanism. When I was a young teacher and researcher at the university, we always worked together and had very regular meetings because the senior practitioner, Nina Roche de Trobbenberg and Vikash Sentub, wanted the younger generation to actively participate in the development of projective methods. And I continued with this tradition, a very rich and interactive one. I am very attached to this conception. What I brought to the Rorschach test, more specifically, is a proposition of plural latent contents, plural registers for every card, even if some are more pregnant. I did the same work with TRT. I think that I insisted on how psychic mechanisms manifest themselves and also on their various contributions in several modalities of psychic functioning, both in Rorschach and TRT. It's difficult to summarize, and I propose many developments about the characteristic of the projective situation, quality and nature of the transference, specificity of the frame, openings and limits.
How did this passing of the torch occur for you, and what aspects captivated your interest? What do you consider essential in this approach, and why?
From my point of view, what is essential concerns the study of psychic functioning, which is very important for the patients. Diagnosis and therapeutic decision are essential for them, children, adolescents and adults. But what is very special with projective methods is that they offer a strong knowledge and training for clinical psychologists, even if they don't use them in their practice. There is an original method of listening which can be experienced with projective methods, a deep and detailed analysis of speech that doesn't exist in any other clinical situation and can sensibilize and train clinical psychologists to hear not only manifest projection, but also what the patient cannot say directly about his pains or pleasures.
I would now like to speak about a very discreet figure, Vikashentub, about whom little is known. At the time in the university, the thematic apperception test and the Rorschach were neither taught together nor by the same instructors. Could you explain why and how you contributed to unifying their training for clinical practice and research?
Vikashentub dedicated herself to reviving the analysis of the TRT material proposed by Henri Murray. In collaboration with Rosine Debray, she worked extensively to consolidate the latent content of the TRT images and narratives, and introduced the idea of induced conscious fantasy, which capture the psychic work involved in processing latent stimuli that activate in conscious processes. As soon as I met Vikashentub, I worked with her and other young colleagues. She wanted to perform what she called feuille de dépouillement, analysis sheet, which is a dynamic grid to analyze the TRT stories and covering defense mechanism of specific pathologies: neurosis, hysteria and obsessional neurosis, borderline and narcissistic personalities, psychosis. These defensive organizations are connected with different problematics regarding castration and the Oedipus complex, narcissistic failures and depression, pathological projection and splitting. With clinical experience, I suggest we avoid such a rigid classification and embrace the heterogeneity of the unconscious, which is a fundamental principle for Freud. It's very important for me to analyze psychic functioning deeply, not with the aim of denouncing what is wrong and doesn't work, but to look for what is better and could work. Vikashentub's conceptions of the TRT have influenced me very much for the analysis and interpretation of Rorschach, and I insisted on using both tests with the same patients. From my point of view, differences or contradictions are not determined by the singularity of each test only, but show conflicts and opposition inside psychic functioning.
It seems that you were never entirely convinced by coding grids and systems, despite your involvement in updating and improving the TAT analysis sheets developed by the French School of Projective Methods. What, in your opinion, are the advantages and limitations of such coding system?
It's not absolutely true. I don't agree with the technical approach which only takes coding grids and systems into account, because I think that they could be given plural and different interpretation. What is important for me is to join coding grid and dynamic interpretation which can capture nuances, subtleties, and of course the interaction between stimulus and the patient. When a test card induces regression, for example, we can't blame the patient for associating through primary process. It would be a paradoxical injunction and interpretation. I think that we must be attentive to the variation in responses to the different cards. But I think that coding grids are necessary to support a rigorous method, and I'm still very attached to a double form of analysis and interpretation of the Rorschach. The classical one is essential. The clinical reading is not sufficient for me.
I know that you have been deeply concerned by transmission and training, and were indeed a passionate and highly regarded professor. How did you organize things at the university to integrate projective psychology into the training of psychologists for both professional practice and research?
Transmission has always been an essential and intense experience in my life. Not only because I received a lot from my teachers and identify with them, but also because transmission and training were very creative and generous for me. I receive by giving. Training is interactive, and students' queries and uncertainties are very fruitful. For me, there is no gap between clinical materials and theories. As you know, I am very loyal to Freud epistemology, and I think that it's still pertinent. There are constant interactions between clinical material and metapsychology. They test each other, and this experience doesn't end because the human psyche is so enigmatic and never completely known. When I was a teacher at the university, I wanted to share my clinical experience and always use examples from my practice to show students how complicated and fascinating it was, and how we had to remain modest in front of its mysteries. It's why I have always worked with patients at the hospital and in my private practice. I retired from the university 12 years ago, but I continue my task of training young analysts. I am very involved in research and transmission through psychoanalysis, both clinical and theory.
During the congresses of the International Society of Rorschach and Projective Methods, I collaborated several times with Noriko Nakamura from Japan and Iram Atak from Turkey to invite young colleagues from various countries to share their interest in projective methods and discuss any difficulties encountered. Many reported a lack of interest or even disdain for projective methods in current psychology training. The Rorschach, even with Exner's comprehensive system, or AirPass, the TAT and other projective methods are seen as outdated, unscientific, and too time-consuming. In a paper published in 2002, some colleagues who were highly critical of projective methods concluded, it is interesting to imagine a time when psychologists may replace their Rorschach cards with a DNA kit and a pocket scanner. Over 20 years later, we are not quite there yet, but the idea persists. What are your thoughts on these views? What would you like to convey to young colleagues as they imagine the future of the Rorschach?
I'm sad when I read these conceptions. It's a pity to lose such rich and fruitful methods. They are the only tests which can bring such precious and quite exhaustive information about psychic life. To reduce them to quantitative data without taking the originality of every individual person into account is a loss. I am sad also because the resistances and fights against psychoanalytic interpretation of projective methods are tied to a strong rejection of the unconscious, perhaps even a denial. The values are impacted by an ideological system where everything can be controlled, nothing can escape, no mystery, no enigma, no question. For me, it could be the end of thinking about the human condition. But at the same time, I'm confident, I'm sure that many people won't abandon the creative and exploratory ways, and that the younger generation will pursue them.
One last question, dear Catherine. What part of your professional life are you most proud of?
It's difficult for me to answer. Of course, I am proud, but I'm essentially happy because I enjoyed and still enjoy so much clinical research and transmission in my career. The three are tightly linked for me. As I told you, I like being an analyst so much, I liked being a teacher so much, I liked being a clinical psychologist using projective methods, probably because psychic functioning and mental health care were so fascinating and essential for me.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for your time together. It was not easy for you nor for me to speak in English like that. We are all the more grateful to you for sharing your experience, knowledge, and convictions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.